This. I combined two common items in a powerful new way. I told my readers to harness the cleaning power of ammonia with the whitening power of bleach.
Ammonia and bleach? You told people to mix ammonia and bleach?
Only if they want bathroom fixtures that shine like the sun.
Peggy, that's the recipe for mustard gas.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I've got a really lot going on with this file, so hang in there. It's very interesting how they took a dangerous thing like mustard gas and turned it into chemotherapy treatment. This week, RFK Jr. was talking about GRAS, GRAS, and it reminded me that I have omitted talking about that. GRAS, GRAS, that is called generally regarded as safe. That is in the U.S. food system. There are categories for things that we think it's safe. So, and that's called GRAS. So they have decided that decades ago that if they considered some things generally recognized as safe, now the same people who think plutonium in our water is a good idea. So if they think it's generally accepted as safe, then it doesn't have to be on the label. So that's out there. But so today I'm going to be talking about all this deal with chemotherapy and also with sugar. There was Harvard is back at it again this week. They keep talking about butter consumption. High butter consumption has increased mortality risk, including deaths from cancer and cardiovascular disease. The research published in JAMA, JAMA Internal Medicine, keep these words in mind, suggests that replacing butter with plant-based oils such as olive oil, canola oil, and soybean oil may confer health benefits and reduce the risk of premature death. Well, you notice how they slid into here, replacing butter with things like olive oil. Then they add the seed oils, canola oil, and soy. So they kind of are polluting the whole thing, right? It's going to cause long-term death. Well, frankly, that was the whole butter thing that got this whole thing started in the 60s, with they had to remove fat from things. So what they do? Well, they put in sugar. So what I'm pointing out, this study just came out from Harvard, okay? Keep that in mind. And JAMA, their magazine that they publish these things in, right? Well, let's talk first about Harvard. Harvard receives a significant amount of funding from taxpayer dollars, primarily through federal research grants and contracts. For example, in fiscal year 2024, Harvard's total operating revenue was $6.5 billion, with 16% of this coming from sponsored research, which includes federal funding, your tax dollars at work. They won't let your kids into these universities, but they'll take your money to fund them. This means that approximately 1.04 billion of Harvard's revenue in that year was likely sourced from federal taxpayer dollars. So, out of $6.5 billion of their operating revenue, 1 billion came likely from federal tax dollars. Harvard University has an enormous financial foundation, primarily through its endowment. They're sitting on a ton of cash. As of June 30th, 2023, Harvard's endowment was valued at 50.7 billion US dollars, making it the largest academic endowment in the entire world. This endowment supports various aspects of the university, including research, financial aid, and campus operations. And I'll read an old article from the 80s. Newly released documents reveal that the sugar industry bribed high profile and influential scientists from Harvard University, paying them to publish fake news about the primary cause of heart attacks. It was disclosed in a special report in JAMA Internal Magazine that shocked the research community. If the experts are taking bribes and lying about the cause of heart attacks, what else might they be lying about? Well, in the 1960s, there was no obligation to disclose conflicts of interest, enabling sugar industry executives to collaborate extensively with the researchers in revising and refining their papers until it met their desired standards, all without the need to acknowledge their own involvement. It was so blatant and the bribe was so big, funding research is not ethical. Bribing researchers to produce the evidence you want is not correct. The fake research was published in a literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine, their biggest journal. They all tout the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967. I graduated from high school in 1969, just to put this in perspective, and I'm now 73 years old. It claimed that fat and cholesterol were the main dietary factors contributing to heart disease, while disregarding evidence from the 1950s that linked sugar to heart disease as well. According to the latest report, the review was funded by the Sugar Research Foundation, or SRF, which is now known as the Sugar Association. The SRF's involvement in the study was not disclosed until 1984. Dr. Mark Hegsted, and you need to write this guy's name down. Hegsted, Hedsted. This guy is nothing but a eugenist. Think about this. How many people have gotten cancer and lived horrible lives because of Dr. Mark Hegsted, a nutritional professor at Harvard? He co-directed the SRF's initial research project on heart disease from 1965 to 1960. And remember that name, Dr. Mark Hegsted. In the new report from the University of California, they discovered correspondence that revealed how Dr. Hegsted, or a criminal, was commissioned by the SRF to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. Archives from the University of Illinois and the Harvard Medical Library demonstrate that the foundation established the objective for the literature review, providing funding, and reviewed drafts of the manuscript. So in 1962, an American Medical Association nutrition report indicated that low-fat, high-sugar diets might actually contribute to the development of cholesterol. According to the new report, 2 years later, John Hickerson, Hickson, write these names down and do not forget them, the vice president of the SRF, proposed a major change to counter negative perceptions of sugar. Increasingly, epidemiological reports suggest that blood sugar rather than blood cholesterol or high blood pressure was a more accurate predictor of I can't say it. Arthrosclerosis. 2 days after, the New York Herald Tribune published a full-page story linking sugar to various health issues in July 1965. The SRF approved Project 226, a literature review on cholesterol metabolism led by Hegsted and, among others, Frank Stare, Stare, or Frederick Stare, another Harvard nutritionist with financial ties to the industry. 9 months later, as Schmidt and her colleagues state, Hegsted explained that the project had been delayed due to the constant need to write counter-arguments against new evidence linking sugar to heart disease published during that period. By September 1966, according to the report, Hickson requested additional drafts of the literature from the Harvard researchers, although there was no direct evidence of the foundation commenting on or editing the drafts. By November the 2nd, Hickson had approved the latest draft as exactly what we had in mind. The two-part review concluding that the only necessary change to prevent heart disease was to reduce dietary fat intake was published the following year with no mention of the sugars industry's involvement. The journal, and listen up to this, the journal did not require disclosure of interest until 1984. The Sugar Association paid highly esteemed people to indicate there was no risk factor with sugar. This had an impact on the entire research community and the direction it took. Well, of course it did. Same way doctors say that um, cancer is genetic, and I'll have more on that in a bit. You start with the first lie, and then you have to make the other lies match the first lie, right? For example, during this period, much of the messaging on how to prevent heart disease revolved around choosing margarine over butter, which has lower saturated fat content. Well, they were also trying to push people into those seed oils, those dangerous seed oils. Also, margarine is nothing but seed oil trash. They went on to say, now we know that margarine is high in trans fats, which contribute to heart disease and have been mostly eliminated from the U.S. They're still out there. These people obviously never walked through a U.S. grocery store. When manufacturers reduced fat, they added sugar. We've lost a significant amount of time in evaluating how sugar affects coronary heart disease, but it is impossible to measure, and this is very important. This is very important. The actual impact on public health over the last 5 decades, 50 years, we've had bad data. In a paper published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2016, researchers suggested that in the 1960s, the sugar industry paid scientists to obscure the relationship between sugar and heart disease, derailing the course of nutrition science and policy for years to come. So the review said a trade group called Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard scientists to review what the literature said about the role of fat and sugar on heart disease. The review, published in 1967 in a prestigious journal, downplayed the role of sugar, blaming saturated fats instead. And keep in mind, I've talked about this in the past. I'm not going to go through every detail, but we have to have cholesterol. Our brains need that fat. We need fat. It's a very important part. These people conspired to take a key piece of information off the charts, off the table for us, right? So people throw on numbers. They say that Mark Hegsted, keep in mind, Hegsted. I have to look later to see if the guy's still alive. But anyways, Mark Hegsted was paid $6,500, but that is in today's money, it's 50,000. So he really didn't get paid 50,000 in the 60s. Oh, it's good to keep your facts straight. So let me see. The report was published in 1967 in the New York Journal of Medicine. Yeah, and people have reverted to believing the Journal of Medicine after their shady past. People need to get past some of these things. You need to not get past some of these things, what I meant to say. We never should have gotten past the horrible experimentation they did on the black community. We have allowed them a pass for a lot of things, but not my point for today. One thing is clear, the food industry keeps funding research today with dire consequences. In 2015, New York Times reported that Coca-Cola had paid scientists to distract the public from the connection between sugary drinks and obesity. In 2016, the Associated Press showed that candy makers funded a study showing that kids who eat candy weigh less than those who don't. In an ideal world, probably, and listen to this very carefully, and I'll explain why. In an ideal world, probably nutritional research should be much more heavily funded by the government, this person said. But the government also has a limited amount of money and has to choose priority. And none of those statements are true. They're saying the research should be more heavily funded by the government. Well, it already is funded by the government. The government is doling out billions of dollars to all of these esteemed universities. So eugenist people in Harvard can come up with these things that undoubtedly have killed millions and millions and millions of people by that one guy taking that bribe. That is exactly how it works. So today, my point for today, there's some new information about cancer. Dr. Seyfried has a new show out, and in the past, when I last left off, none of this is going to make sense if you haven't seen the last two shows, and no, I'm not going to recap. So let me start over here. In the last couple of shows, I've talked about Dr. Seyfried and his groundbreaking new work as far as the relationship with cancer, okay? When I was talking to you about it last, he was talking about glutamate. And I said, I threw up my hands. I don't know what he is talking about when it's referenced to glutamate. I literally tossed in the towel on the glutamate part. Well, he came back with a new clip this week or last week, and he explains the glutamine part that is actually sunk into my brain. So I'm going to be able to explain the glutamine part to you today because it is critical. Because his whole premise is hey, wait a minute, for 100 years they've used the same treatment and it's not working. Yes, Dr. Seyfried, this is what's called eugenics, okay? And so it brought my attention back to something else. In the past, I've talked about mustard gas. You realize that mustard gas is what became the therapy they use called chemotherapy. And it still boggles my mind that they use a poison, mustard gas, that they developed during World War One, and they created that to be the cure for cancer. It is mind-boggling. And I finally put all those little pieces together in my brain, so I want to share that with you today. So because it's fascinating and a bit paradoxical, and I had some chat GPT things, and I'll put most of this down below. So ChatGPT and I were talking about mustard gas, and it said the story of mustard gas transforming into a cancer treatment is a testament to human ingenuity. During World War II, researchers, highly esteemed researchers, I'm sure, observed that mustard gas, a chemical weapon, caused a significant reduction in white blood cells. Well, this leads to one thing, right? When you get lung cancer and the kind of cancer I now have from radiation, from being in a home with a smart meter zapping me with the plutonium, it wipes out all of your blood cells, your white blood cells. That's why people come up with things like leukemia. They have a reduction in white blood cells. So, right here, they're already admitting that researchers observed that mustard gas, a chemical weapon, it caused a significant reduction in white blood cells. Well, of course it did. This led scientists to wonder if a derivative of mustard gas could target rapidly dividing cancer cells like those in lymphoma 2. This discovery marked the beginning of chemotherapy. Nitrogen mustard, a less toxic derivative, became one of the first chemotherapy agents. And I've been talking endlessly about they're out to destroy our DNA. They want to destroy us for their own class of people. What does this chemical do? Well, it works by damaging the DNA of cancer cells, preventing them from dividing and growing. So far, sounds so good, right? While it's derived from a harmful substance, its controlled use has saved countless lives. Do tell me more. It's a powerful reminder that even something destructive can be repurposed for good with the right knowledge and intent. Well, I'm not sure the right knowledge, maybe the right knowledge, but the intent wasn't there. So I am sure they knew all of this. War was a cover story to get this plutonium for where we are right now to destroy our DNA. They couldn't just say, hey, we're looking for some gases and stuff to wreck your DNA and give you all kinds of cancers and stuff. They had to come up with war. That was where they were doing the testing. The first testing of this stuff was interesting because they were doing it out in the air. Well, they found that out in the air wasn't so good because you get a wind, right? So what I'm going to be doing is I'll tell you the question that I asked ChatGPT. So hopefully, maybe you want to go look for yourself. What I asked them was this. I said, I am confused over how mustard gas became a cure for cancer. That still stumps me. And I found an article, Chemotherapy from World War to the War on Cancer. The first weapon to be successfully deployed against cancer came not from a hospital or lab, but from the trenches of the war that marks its centenary this year. A chemical warfare expert arrived to confront the aftermath, and the post-mortems, he showed up after a bunch of bodies were there, and the post-mortems he ordered showed something startling. People who had succumbed to the poison had very few lymph and bone marrow cells. Back then, cancer was an enigma. One of the few things One of the few things known was that cancer cells, like lymph and bone marrow cells, multiply much faster than normal cells. Very important to know. Cancer cells, like lymph and bone marrow cells, multiply much faster than normal cells. Following the principle that the dose makes the poison, scientists wondered if a low dose of nitrogen mustard could be used to treat cancer. And so chemotherapy was born just like that, like war. It is dangerous and unpredictable, sometimes advancing, often forced to retreat. The first time a patient was treated was called cyclophosphamide, the active part of nitrogen mustard. The tumor actually shrank. Something not even thought possible at the time. So they stumbled on this stuff and they found that this one tumor, okay, but it was a temporary miracle. Treatment had to be stopped when the patient's side effects became life-threatening in themselves. So, yeah, the initial testing they had to stop because the patient was getting ready to be killed, is basically what they're saying here. Life starts with a single cell, and diseases, including cancer, start at the cellular level. Usually, disease causing cells can be found and destroyed because they're obviously different from our normal healthy cells. Penicillin attacks a part of bacterial cells that human cells don't have, leading to the elimination of bacteria with no damage to us. Well, I don't know. Go see my show about antibiotics. But cancer is only but cancer is our own cells slightly alerted, which makes it very challenging to treat. For a long time, they thought our only chance was to attack rapidly dividing cells and accept the collateral damage to normal cells that divide quickly. The loss of a healthy gut, immune system, hair, the devastating side effects of aggressive chemotherapy, but new things are emerging. By the time World War I ended in 1918, mustard gas had intoxicated an estimated 1.2 million soldiers and contributed to 80% of the chemical casualties, making it the deadliest war gas of its time. So, right off the bat, 1918, when it's first used, it intoxicated 1.2 million soldiers and contributed to 80% of the and they thought, hey, this sounds like a great idea. Why don't we give this to people that have cancer? The outbreak of World War II in 1939 intensified nations' efforts to develop, manufacture, and stockpile chemical weapons. Not long after, mustard gas made its reappearance in Bari. So, working with mustard gas has never been safe. In 1860, when Frederick Guthrie from the University of Edinburgh first synthesized mustard gas by reacting ethylene and sulfur dioxide, he experienced irritation on his own skin. That same year, Albert Niemann at the University of Göttingen repeated the reaction and suffered skin reddening and blistering. So, yeah, right from 1860, hey, their skin's blistering, right? Later, Victor Meyer at the University of Göttingen achieved the first reliable synthesis of pure mustard gas by modifying the formula, resulting in a more toxic product. In 1913, Hans Thacker Clark at the University of Berlin, this was all figured out in Germany, by the way. Nothing suspicious about any of this, right? So the guy in Berlin further developed Meyer's formulation and introduced a more efficient method for synthesizing mustard gas. Due to accidental exposure, Clark was hospitalized, but ultimately his method was employed for large-scale mustard gas production during warfare. And there's this person called Alexander. Dangerous chemicals never intimidated Alexander. Back in high school, he had a chemistry lab in the basement of the house, said this person, Nivens. In 1941, read that number, 2 years after the tragic incident in Bari, Alexander had just begun his medical practice in New Jersey when he received a summons from the U.S. Army. Well, isn't that convenient? The United States Chemical Warfare Society, or CWS, which was established during World War I for producing poison gas and defensive equipment, sought out medical experts. I wonder where they got them from. Harvard? From around the country to bolster the Army's preparedness for potential chemical gas attack. And keep in mind, this whole premise with this gas attack and with these vaccines is this: evil has to come packaged as help, right? How often have you heard me say that? Well, because they always have this proposition that we know in the future these people are going to try to kill us. So before they get to kill us, we better figure out these diseases. And before they get to figure out these diseases, let's come up with these vaccines. Before any of this stuff even happens, okay? Before any of this stuff even happens, out of the minds of truly demented psychopaths comes this idea that in order to prepare for the future, we must come up with deadly chemicals now in case somebody else comes up with them next. See this psychopathic thinking going on here? So in 1942 early, the CWS, which is the Chemical Warfare Service, assigned Alexander to investigate a new chemical agent called nitrogen mustard, a volatile liquid with a chemical structure similar to mustard gas that had little to no odor. Using rabbits, Alexander set up experiments on various organs and systems, including the skin, eyes, respiratory tract, and blood. Like mustard gas, nitrogen mustard caused burns on the skin and different organs. However, the agent's effects on the blood astonished Alexander. For a typical burn injury, the immune system usually ramps up white blood cell production to fight off infection. In Alexander's nitrogen mustard experiments, the opposite happened. Within several days after exposure to nitrogen mustard, the rabbits' white blood cell numbers drastically dropped until they completely disappeared. The rabbits' lymph nodes melted away and their bone marrow became depleted of blood cells. After obtaining the same results from other laboratory animals, such as rats and mice, Alexander believed that nitrogen mustard disrupted the body's blood production by attacking white blood cells. He began to wonder if nitrogen mustard would have the same effect on humans. If it did, it might be developed to treat leukemia, a condition marked by uncontrolled growth of white blood cells. Alexander documented his findings and hypotheses in a report published internally within the CWS in June 1942, but his report went unappreciated. A year later, in the aftermath of the Bari attack, Alexander examined the sailors and confirmed his suspicion of mustard gas exposure. As he went through the doctor's medical case sheets and pathology reports, one recurring observation stood out. The white blood cell counts of severely injured patients took a sharp downward turn on the third or fourth day after the incident. These results agreed with Alexander's animal studies at Edgewood, supporting Alexander's interest in turning a poison into a drug to treat leukemia and lymphoma. In December 1943, after conducting extensive blood and bone marrow tests, Alexander submitted a report on his investigation of the Bari disaster. His report was immediately classified by the government. So, right away, the government classified the paperwork to avoid triggering a chemical war. But the United States military advisors, including Cornelius Rhoads, and I've talked in past about Cornelius Rhoads, and I'll have to verify this. I'm just talking off the top of my head right now. I believe Cornelius Rhoads was a guy who was tricking people in Puerto Rico to giving them cancer. But I'll look back at that, and when I take a break here in a bit, I'll conclude that. But somehow this name Cornelius Rhoads is rattling around in my brain pretty hard right now. So the U.S. military medical advisors, including Cornelius Rhoads, chief of the CWS's medical division, carefully appraised Alexander's work, finally taking note of nitrogen mustard's therapeutic potential. Rhoads was very excited about the possibilities of how this could be turned into something useful in peacetime. While Alexander, serving in the CWS investigating chemical weapons at Edgewood, another research program on war gas was secretly occurring 200 miles away. Guess where? Another university, right? In 1942, at Yale School of Medicine, the school's dean, Milton Winternitz, signed a government contract with the Office of Research and Development. Winternit had previously studied war gas poisonings during World War I and recognized the urgent need to investigate new chemical warfare agents and develop antidotes. He assigned two young pharmacologists, Alfred Gilman and Louis Goodman, to study the toxicity of the new chemical agent nitrogen mustard, which was coded as substance X, like X marks the spot. Gilman and Goodman began their testing by exposing rabbits, God, those poor rabbits, to substance X. Like Alexander, they observed the rapid disappearance of lymphocytes and granulocytes in the rabbits. The systematic effect of the nitrogen mustards was far more fascinating than the blisters they produced on the skin. They wondered if the agent could destroy fast-growing cancer cells before it attacked the host. The pair consulted Thomas Dougherty, an anatomist at Yale School of Medicine, who provided them with a mouse transplanted with advanced lipocarmia. When Gilman and Goodman treated this mouse with nitrogen mustard, its tumor softened and shrunk after just 2 administrations of the chemical. With more doses, the tumor disappeared. Much to everyone's surprise, the mouse survived a remarkably long time. Of course, Gilman and Goodman eagerly wanted to move forward with a human trial and presented their animal experiment data to Gustav Linson, a chair of surgery at Yale School of Medicine. Encouraged by encouraging results, Linskog agreed to supervise the trial. The team soon found a potential candidate. Boy, that was sure handy. A 47-year-old patient with cancer at Yale New Haven Hospital. Boy, this is all working out like a dream now, isn't it? The patient had terminal lymphoma and had undergone all possible treatment options without any success. Well, since all hope of recovery seemed lost, Linkskog approached the patient, known in history as J.D., with a bold experiment that might save his life. They had a detailed conversation with this person called J.D. about what they were undertaking. and that this was an experimental option and that nobody knew what was going to happen, said Dieter Linkser's grandson and yeah, their kids are always in this thing. So JD decided to take the risk. They had no idea, clue, or anything resembling guidance on dosing. Their best hint was their toxicity studies on rabbits, which suggested a dosage 0.1 micrograms per kilogram of nitrogen mustard. A few days later, JD became the first recipient of intravenous chemotherapy chemotherapy for cancer. Well, it really is kind of chemotherapy cancer, right? Chemotherapy gives you cancer, chemotherapy heals the cancer, chemotherapy, a good drug for all. Okay, the patient's tumor had a marvelous response, said Lithgog. Within 48 hours, the tumor began to soften. The patient felt better. By the 10th day, when a series of injections ended, his tumor was no longer palpable, and all cancer symptoms had disappeared. Boy, this is sounding more like a miracle. By day 49, the patient's tumor made a vigorous return. Oh, so okay, this only so by day 49, the patient's tumor made a vigorous return and became resistant to nitrogen mustard. Kind of a shame, huh? But that didn't stop him, don't worry. Despite receiving 2 additional courses of treatment, his condition failed to improve. He eventually passed away on day 96. Due to the confidentiality surrounding chemical warfare agents, the medical records of this trial were censored and later lost to time, leaving many details undisclosed. Gee, this is a miracle, isn't it? It's also a miracle how they lost all the records. Miracles all around, right? The guy dies, he lives an extra 96 days. 96, of course, and 9 and 6. So let's keep going. This is why I'm always yelling, always start at the beginning, because, it's like I'm working with trying to figure out this Opus Dei stuff. The people who are probably smuggling all the kids. Well, the founder of Opus Dei used to beat himself with whips, okay? So that's why I'm always saying, look at the beginning, right? So, modern chemotherapy. In June 1943, the nitrogen mustard research group at Yale University dispersed, but the clinical trials testing nitrogen mustard's therapeutic potential continued. Goodman collaborated with researchers in several institutions around the country to treat additional patients. Goodman, and their collaborators released details about their studies in 1946 after World War II had ended and the secrecy associated with the war gas program had been lifted. Such a relief. This landmark report, they documented 67 nitrogen mustard clinical trials, including JD's case for treating Hodgkin's disease, lymphoscarmosis, and various types of leukemia. The report demonstrated significant tumor regression in most patients, with clinical remissions lasting from weeks to months. Rhoads, who previously appreciated Alexander's Bari report, was further encouraged by Gilman and Goodman's clinical trials. He started vigorously seeking funding for developing chemotherapy after the war. In 1948, Rhoads became the director of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which spearheaded the development of several important chemotherapy drugs, including mustard derivatives and other anti-tumor compounds. So this Rhoads guy, pretty in the middle of things, isn't he? In 1949, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved methylchloroquine, a nitrogen mustard compound, as the first chemotherapy drug for hematological malignancies. Around that time, scientists began to understand how the agents worked in the body. Two chemists, Philip Lawley and Peter Brooks at the Royal Cancer Hospital, unraveled the molecular mechanisms behind the agent's cancer-killing properties. Mustard gas and nitrogen mustard both belong to a class of chemicals known as alkylating agents. In the cells, these agents undergo a series of reactions to form a highly reactive intermediary, which coagularly modifies DNA in a reaction referred to as DNA alkylation. DNA alkylation disrupts cell replication and causes cellular damage, which makes alkaline agents particularly effective at destroying rapidly dividing cells such as white blood cells and cancer cells. And if you're like me, you're starting to think, boy, this is starting to sound like it's making it more dangerous. Well, that's my impression also, so I'll keep reading along here. This information stimulated researchers to synthesize and test more alkylating compounds to fight cancer. Several new chemotherapy drugs emerged during the 1950s, such as chlorobuzin and bufalfed, alkaline agents that treat leukemia by stopping white blood cells from growing and spreading. Over the following decades, scientists introduced more than 100 different chemotherapy drugs into clinical practice to treat numerous cancer types, including leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, sarcoma, and breast, lung, and ovarian cancers. Pretty impressive, right? They introduced more than 100 chemotherapy drugs. And did anybody consider the diet? Oh, wait a minute. Probably not. I'll keep reading here. Chemotherapy created an entirely new specialty, practice in field of medicine. Oh, isn't this handy? At this point, there will absolutely be leaps, breakthroughs, and huge paradigm change, says the director of Yale University School of Medicine. Chemotherapy has led to remarkable remission rates. And, remember, none of this stuff is true, okay? But I'm just going to read it like it's true because everybody gets dead from cancer because they're killing you with the treatment. But I'm going to read this like it's true, right? Because I really can't stop every 2 seconds and dispute the lies. So put on your thinking caps, kids, and just pick out the lies for yourself. I'll just read along. Chemotherapy has led to remarkable remission rates and prolonged survival for numerous patients. Its success in killing fast-dividing cancer cells laid the foundation for the development of more effective therapeutic approaches, such as targeted therapies and immunotherapies. Chemotherapy created, cha-ching, 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 an entirely new specialty practice in field of medicine. As researchers continue to make leaps and bounds in chemotherapy development, others are still uncovering hidden details about its early days. Although J.D.'s case was published in Gilman's report in 1946, the details of the case were minimal, and J.D.'s medical reports disappeared. I can't stop saying something. I'll repeat it one more time. As researchers continue to make leaps and bounds in chemotherapy development, others are still uncovering hidden details about its early days. Although J.D.'s case was published in Gilman's report in 1946, listen up, the details of the case were minimal, and J.D.'s medical records disappeared. Whoops. In 2010, John Finn, a surgeon and Lindsay's colleague at Yale School of Medicine, learned about the saga of the first chemotherapy trial Gilman, Goodman, and Lissog conducted during World War II. Fascinated by it, Finn teamed up with his colleague Robert Udelman, a former clinical professor of surgery at Yale School of Medicine and current surgeon at the Miami Cancer Institute, to unearth J.D.'s medical records. We contacted a senior colleague in pathology, Udelman recalled. The pathology department had an independent database for the archive of every patient seen at Yale based on their diagnosis, the patient's name, their medical record, and the year. Lacking key information such as name, date of birth, and medical record number, Finn and Udelman had only the patient's initials, which matched with numerous pathology reports from the early 1940s. After months of searching, they identified a promising pathological report of a patient with lymphosarcoma and a medical record number, but that did not lead to JD's medical reports. Suspecting error in the record number, they began rearranging the number sequences and inserting additional numbers. After several failed searches, they eventually tracked down JD's complete medical records. It was exciting at the time, said Udelsman. I remember when John put the chart down in my hands. I had the original chart right in front of me. I couldn't believe we found it. If this really the if this is really the first form of intravenous chemotherapy with an antiplastic agent in the world, it's giant. It should be in every textbook. The uncovered record shed new light on JD's personal background and clinical course. As a Polish immigrant, JD moved to the United States at age 18 and lost his family during the war. He didn't speak English and worked in a ball bearing factory. He had no spouse, no children, said Udelman. It sounded like a very lonely, isolated life. The lost, and this is exactly the people they look out. When you're getting gang stalk, for example, they do a checkup on your family and stuff. If they find that your family is not in communication with you or your family has no money, all that kind of stuff, they go after you harder. So what they do is they're always evaluating us to see where the risk is, right? They would rather grab a rando kid off the street than somebody who somebody may come looking for, right? So that's always their approach. So this poor JD guy didn't even speak English, right? The lost files also added context to JD's previous treatments, offering insight into why he might have chosen to participate in this experimental trial. He was diagnosed with lymphosarcoma in 1940 and underwent multiple radiation treatments at Yale New Haven Hospital in 1941. Unfortunately, his tumor became progressively unresponsive, causing respiratory distress, dysplasia, and weight loss. Patients noted in JD's medical records that his outlook was utterly hopeless. Physicians noted in JD's medical records that his outlook was utterly hopeless. They were watching his tumor grow on a daily basis, noted Uelsman. In different situations, doctors are more inclined to use potentially toxic agents and toxic doses of an agent to try to have a therapeutic benefit. Although the treatment did not ultimately save JD's life, Smith was not surprised. It is common in chemotherapy that patients develop clones of lymphocytes that are refractory to treatment. A few cells remain that are surviving, and they become more and more refractory to the drug, he explained. Nowadays, we use combination chemotherapeutical treatments for this very reason. So they're talking about refractory, and refractory means is resisting control or authority or stubborn. So they're saying these tumors are refractory. In 2011, Fenman and Uelsman published their investigation of JD's case in the Journal of American College of Surgeons, finally setting JD's record straight 6 decades after the case and bringing to light the complicated history of chemotherapy treatment. If this is really the first form of intravenous chemotherapy with an antiplastic agent in the world, it's giant, said Ulderman. It should be in every textbook. So, let me see here. Then I found an article. Well. Would any sane person infect their entire body with toxins and cripple their immune system just to address one certain area? The year is not 1819 or 1919, it's 2019. But for some reason, 100 million Americans believe that one of the most destructive forms of medicine is their best option for attacking their sickened, mutated cells. We don't use bloodletting or electroshock treatment for cancer. So why on earth does anyone use such an archaic treatment such as chemical warfare on their own body? Warning, mustard gas is extremely dangerous. Contact with the liquid or exposure to the vapor can cause blindness and severe burns. Mustard gas can also burn the soft tissue of the lungs and cause shortness of breath. Mustard gas derivatives, cyclophoramine, chloramine, methamphetamine, I can't even pronounce these words, are currently being used as chemotherapy in America, even though the formula is a death wish for the rest of the body. Want some history so you don't repeat it yourself? During World War II, naval personnel who were exposed to mustard gas during military action were found to have toxic changes in the bone marrow cells that developed into blood cells. That drug was a precursor of mexitine, the very same drug frequently used to treat cancer now. Has the medical community lost their collective minds? Or are they in the business of spreading cancer to make themselves more money and keep their patients spending, all the while suffering needlessly? Yes, there is a very large element of masochism and sadomasochism and all of this, right? They enjoy seeing the infliction of pain on others. And I would have to argue some of them would also likely classify as masochists that they inflict pain on themselves also. They usually go hand in hand. Sulfur mustard chemotherapy damages bone marrow cells needed for making blood cells, debilitating the human immune system. How could anyone legitimately fight and beat cancer without a normal functioning immune system? How can any human being stay positive and limit stress when the medicine being pumped into their blood at the hospital contains chemicals that severely disrupt the central nervous system and the digestive tract? Cholinic toxicity is a condition marked by gastrointestinal cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea. The body loses the ability to retain nutrients and suffers nutritional deficiencies. The number one cause of over 900 diseases, including disorder of the cells or cancer. Research at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine discovered that chemotherapy spreads cancer throughout the body, causing a spike in cancer cells that circulate through the body, searching for other damaged tissues and organs to take over. So even if the chemo kills the cancer at the targeted area, the rest of the body is polluted with chemicals that trigger a massive breeding of mutated, their TMEM complexes and circulating tumor cells, including metastatic dissemination that you may never be able to defeat. 100 years ago, 17 million people died in a war, many of whom suffered from chemical warfare attacks on their front lines, stuck in the trenches in a living hell while breathing in deadly gases created by industrialist chemists. Reports of a shimmering cloud came in, describing a strange, peppery smell in the air. The soldiers that survived developed horrific blisters and sores and then began coughing up blood. They had been poisoned with mustard gas, and they would all die within 6 weeks. Just because mainstream medicine and most medical doctors declare chemotherapy as your best chance at beating cancer, does that mean it is true? There are many choices for fighting and beating cancer, and ones that yield much higher chances of success without creating new cancers. So then I started asking Chat GPT, and I'll share with you down below what I asked. So hopefully you'll pick up on what are good keywords to use. So what I asked Chat GPT, I said, "Do you inherit cancer better? Do you inherit cancer, or is it better to blame mom and dad versus sugar? Because they always say it's genetic, right? So let's explore what that means." And Chat GPT said, yes, let's break it down a bit more clearly. Most cancers are not inherited directly, but genetic factors could play a role. Inherited versus acquired mutations. These are mutations passed from parent to child through DNA. They're present in every cell of your body from birth. Inherited mutations cause about 5 to 10% of all cancers. So, some of the more common inherited ones are BRCA and BRCA2. They're mutations. They're linked to breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers. Lynch syndrome increases the risk of colon, endometrial, stomach, and other cancers. TP53 mutations, a rare mutation that raises the risk of multiple types of cancer. APCG mutations associated with familiar leading to a high risk of colorectal cancer. So most cancers, about 90 to 95%, happen to mutations that occur during a person's lifetime. So these mutations aren't passed on to children. So what they say about how do you know if cancer might run in your family? As a matter of fact, my father died of cancer of the esophagus. I am of the belief, because my father was a navigator in the U.S. Air Force, I am of the belief 100% that my father got cancer of the esophagus after flying around on military planes his whole career. They were breathing in masks with plastic. Those masks that they breathe into are the same kind of things. They have people on those CPAC machines now that are killing people. So I believe my father got lung cancer from wearing one of those masks during his work. So I just stopped putting that down on my medical records, because the minute I put down that my father had cancer, they started acting like, well, you're going to get it too. Well, wait a minute. I wasn't flying in planes, so I probably didn't get the same kind of cancer my dad got. My dad didn't inherit his cancer. He got it from being part of the U.S. military. So you got to always be careful what you put down those records, because they lead them to the wrong directions, right? Because they don't even know what the basis is. So how are you even a doctor if you don't even know this stuff, right? Those of us gathered around right now are figuring this stuff out. You think the entire medical community never sat around and thought about any of this stuff? Like, hey, where'd mustard gas come from? Never entered their mind to ask, right? Nobody ever had any curiosity. Yeah, sure, right, okay. So, anyways, then they had some signs. They said, here are some signs that a cancer might have a hereditary component. Multiple relatives on the same side of the family with the same or related cancers. Breast or ovarian. Well, multiple relatives on the same side of the family. All of those relatives likely eat the same diet, right? They probably do have the same habits. And another thing they say, cancer occurring at a younger age than typical. Breast cancer before age 40. Well, yeah, because it has to do with that sugar, right? Also, it might run in your family if it's a rare cancer showing up, like male breast cancer or certain adult child cancers. Yeah, that's all BS, because it's not coming from your parents, okay? If this sounds familiar, genetic testing could help uncover any inherited. And that's where they're making all the money now. 23andMe just went bankrupt. What does that mean? Well, all bets are off. You know that form you signed that said they were never going to use your information for any data collecting? Well, your information is being sold right now. What's going on right now with this trying to take over Social Security in the U.S. government? Well, what does Silicon Valley want more than anything? Data. Data is what runs Silicon Valley. They're clamping down on Social Security, which people actually paid into that. It's not some gift from these people. They're clamping down on that because they see money there, and they could also steal all that money. So, anyhow, so It says, can you reduce the risk if you have a family history? It said, yes, you have a higher genetic risk, but that doesn't mean cancer is inevitable. You can still lower your chances. Screening earlier. Here you go again. The recommendations are worse than the disease. Do you realize when they do scanning for pregnancy scannings, those kids, some of them come out damaged. The tests are as crazy as the actual outcome, right? Like, for example, I was diagnosed with having weakened bone thing from the pills they had me on. Well, 1 year later, I was given no medical advice what to do. They said, take some calcium. Well, 1 year later, I had triple ankle fracture. Well, I never knew how my bones were because the tests they do for osteoporosis, at least in this country, they measure your bones against a 25-year-old. So I would have been in my 60s when I got this bone test done, and they said that I was at risk for broken bones. Well, it must have been even worse because they were measuring me against a 25-year-old. So the tests are as bad as the other things. So right off the bat, you can lower your chances by doing more screening. Totally not true. Like mammograms, coloscopies, or MRIs, those things will harm you more. And this is not just my opinion. So, preventative surgeries, and this is really where it gets crazy. Angelina Jolie was pushing that. Well, my mother had cancer, so I'm going to whack off both of my breasts. Well, she's just a lying transgender. We're living in a monkey see, monkey do environment. People think, oh yeah, well Angelina Jolie got her boobs cut off, so maybe I should do it too. Stop thinking that way. Use your own head for a change. Preventative surgeries. Some high risk individuals choose to remove breasts, ovaries, and other at risk tissues. Yeah, they're really quick clicking that stuff off, aren't they? Medications. Drugs like tamoxifen or aspirin can lower the risk for. And just last week they came. That business about taking a aspirin a day to. That really wasn't quite right. So trust is at your own. Lifestyle changes, healthy diet, regular exercise, avoiding smoking, and limiting alcohol. And here again, you notice the wording limiting alcohol. They're not saying cut out alcohol where they should be, right? Alcohol jacks up your sugar. Alcohol is loaded, absolutely loaded with sugar. And alcohol is your best way to attract entities into your space. So if you want to keep drinking, you better start getting used to who the other entities that you're sharing your space with are. So let's start back to where they claim this stuff came from. Now, this whole stuff about the Egyptians, if those pyramids were real, then maybe I'd believe this Egyptian stuff. But I'm just going to go ahead and read what they say. The earliest known descriptions of cancer date all the way back to ancient Egypt around 3000 BCE. The Egyptians, and remember, the gypsies were called gypsies because they were confused with being Egyptians, okay? Just keep that in mind here, okay? The Egyptians described cases of tumors in a medical text known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a surgical manual. It mentioned a condition with bulging tumors of the breast and stated that there was no treatment. But the term cancer itself comes from Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician often called the father of medicine around 400 BCE. He used the Greek word carcinosis, Carcinos, and carcinoma to describe tumors because the finger-like spreading projections of the tumor reminded him of a crab's shake. Later, Galen, Galen, a Roman physician around 200 CE, also used the word onkos, O-N-C-O-S, which is Greek for swelling. This eventually became the root of oncology, the study of cancer. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until the 17th and 18th century that scientists began understanding cancer more deeply, especially when microscopes came into play. Rudolf Virchow in the 19th century pioneered the idea that cancer starts from abnormal cells, leading to the foundation of modern cancer research. Surgery, the first weapon. Ancient Egypt, early descriptions of tumor removals through rudimentary surgeries. In the 1800s, the development of anesthesia and antiseptics, thanks to Joseph Lisser, made surgery safer and more effective. Well, I don't think that anything has improved. These people have the same low skill levels they've always had. That's why they're psychopaths, right? Psychopaths give everybody the impression that they're very smart just by their grandiose thinking, the way they present themselves, wearing those white coats and stuff. That does not equal smart. Evil does not translate into they're smart people. It just means they're evil. The next one, radiation therapy, harnessing X-rays. 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. 1896, Emil Grubbe became the first to use X-rays to treat a cancer patient. 1896. Today, radiation has evolved. Well, I don't know who you're talking to, but they say radiation has evolved into highly targeted forms like proton therapy. Well, people are still dropping like flies as it hit. There has not been, like Dr. Seyfried has said, there has not done any changes in the last 100 years. And so right now, I am going to take a quick break and I'm going to play Dr. Seyfried's quote. And I'm also going to be playing a quick quote. So I'm having trouble saying a quick quote clip about chemical warfare of World War I, just so we get a basis there. And then when I come back on the other side, I will wrap this up and where we stand today. So
okay, so let's look a little bit more detail at this, our Greek study, successful application of dietary ketogenic metabolic therapy in patients with glioblastoma, a clinical study of 18 people. And look at what they did. So the patients all had standard of care. That means they had surgery and they had radiation. And despite that, those that could adhere to this diet, which was a calorie-restricted Mediterranean diet, which again was far more palatable and easier to adhere to than some previous other clinical studies where we eat more lard and things that were not as palatable as this Mediterranean diet, which consisted mostly of salmon, sardines, avocados, various kinds of olive oils and some vegetables. But the meat, the protein came largely from sardines and salmon. It wasn't too terribly difficult. People, to me, it would seem that people should be able to follow. I could follow something like that. I mean, it's not like salmons and sardines, avocados. I mean, this is not so drastically different, calorie restricted. But it was very interesting. Of the people who adhered to the diet, there was 6 out of 18 that adhered to the diet, and 4 of them survived beyond 3 years. The other thing too, let's look at overall survival for glioblastoma. The median survival today is between 8 to 15 months, which is very similar to what was found in 1926 by Bailey and Cushing. So we really haven't made any major advance in managing glioblastoma in just about 100 years. 100 years, no advance. That's what I always found to be striking, right? Think about it. You got the Webb telescope that's circling the Earth 1 million miles, looking at the origin of the universe, and we still haven't made any advance in managing glioblastoma. Why is that? Well, first of all, the tumor is aggressive. There's no question about that. If you don't do anything, you could live to be 8 to 15 months if you don't do anything. Now, if you have standard of care, which is surgical debulking, followed by radiotherapy, together with temozolomide, you can live maybe to 17 or 18 months. Maybe you could push out 24 months, but not much advance in doing those things. So we published a paper in 2010 in Lancet Oncology, and we followed this up with more recent papers, Why is it that these glioblastoma patients don't survive for very long? And the answer is because of the treatments they receive. We now know unambiguously that these tumor cells are driven by the sugar glucose and the amino acid glutamine. Those are the two predominant fuels that drive the dysregulated growth, and we know they can't switch to ketones or fatty acids. We have done this over and over and over again and looked at dozens and dozens of studies. So knowing that the tumor cells thrive on glucose and glutamine, then you treat the patients with radiation, and radiation drives blood sugars through the roof. Radiation by itself makes the blood sugar go very high. When you irradiate the brain, it gets hot and swells. And in order to reduce the swelling, you give steroids. And steroids, like dexamethasone, also elevate blood sugar. So two of the procedures that you are using, radiation and steroids, elevate blood sugar, which is the fuel for the tumor. When you debulk glioblastoma, that means to surgically resect it, almost invariably, you never get the whole tumor. Almost all surgeons will say, we got most of course you got most of it. You got whatever you saw. But it infiltrates into the local area and you can't see that. And the tumor cells migrate to distances away from the central mass, and you never get that. So they always say, oh, yeah, we got most of it. Of course, you get 95, 98%, but you left 2% that'll come back and kill you. Now, you take the tumor out, you create a wound. As soon as the patient recovers from the wound of debulking, you then give them radiation, and the radiation makes the sugar go through the roof, and you give the steroid to reduce the swelling from the radiation, and that makes the sugar go higher. And not only that, when you irradiate the brain, you have a tendency to break apart. There's special connections between neurons and glia in the brain that have a glutamine-glutamate cycle. I'm going to go into the neurochemistry. You just have to know about the neurochemistry of how your brain works. When one neuron signals another neuron, it releases a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it goes from one neuron to the other in a gap, but it has to be removed as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it will create a seizure, and the glial cells take up the glutamate and convert it back into glutamine and then pass it back to the neuron. You have this very tight cycle. When you surgically debulk and irradiate, you break that cycle. You free up massive amounts of glutamate, which are excitotoxic molecule. The glial cells will now take up the glutamate and convert it back into glutamine and dump that into the microenvironment. Any tumor there is going to suck down that glutamine like there's no tomorrow. So between the radiation, the steroids, and all of this stuff, you free up massive amount of glucose and glutamine in the tumor microenvironment based on the surgical procedures and the treatment you're doing to these patients. I told you, if the tumor cells need glucose and glutamine as the prime fuels, and you create an environment enriched with those two fuels, what is the outcome of that procedure? Death. And that's why when you look at survival curves, they're so horrible and they haven't changed in all these years, because you keep doing the same thing over and over again, reducing the ability of the person with the tumor to have long-term survival. In our individual, Pablo Kelly, he never had radiation or chemo. He had only surgery and diet. And he lived for 10 years, and he died from his fourth surgical debulking from a cerebral hemorrhage, and nothing to do with the cancer. In this new study, the physicians here were forced or had to do standard of care. So their patients were debulked, irradiated, and given temozolomide. Despite that, the diet that they used was able to successfully maintain viability in several of these patients that maintained the diet. Only one died before the 3 years. The others made 3 years, which already is twice as long as you would have it if you did standard of care without this ketogenic metabolic therapy. So 15 to 16 months is the median survival for people getting standard of care, and now you've introduced a therapy on top of standard of care, and we're able to double the survival, even more than that, that's quite remarkable. I think that's because the people doing this study, number one, are very knowledgeable about how to use diets. They used a Mediterranean, calorie-restricted Mediterranean diet. The interesting thing is the people who did not maintain the diet, only one of these people made the 3-year survival, whereas 4 out of 6 made of the people that could maintain it survive for the 3 years and longer. So the question is, why did these people not maintain the diet? And the answer is quite interesting, because I always thought it would be the palatability, but it was more like he has a nice, you can look at each one was kind of different from the other.
An attempt was made to uncover the reasons why these patients ultimately did not follow the diet. One potential reason for non-adherence to the diet in certain cases was the strong desire of close relatives to avoid discussing the seriousness of the diagnosis and the unfavorable prognosis with the patients. This applied to 3 of our patients who had already undergone surgical resection, radiation, and chemotherapy. They felt reassured that they had done everything possible and saw no need to adhere to a demanding diet. Another reason was a lack of trust in the diet. 4 of our patients did not believe that following conventional therapies, a simple diet could be beneficial, despite initially agreeing to follow it.
In order to survive, you have to be knowledgeable and work with the medical staff. The medical staff needs to know what to do, and the patient needs to be educated to know what to do and work with the group. And I think that can account. Now, here's my take on this whole thing. This is only the first step. In my opinion, if we were to use what we now know how to manage glioblastoma, we've written papers on it, we've done preclinical studies on it, don't do radiation. I would say this is contributing to the demise of these patients. You don't do radiation. You do metabolic, if you have an opportunity for a watchful waiting period, and sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. That's a call by the neurosurgeon. You shrink that tumor down using metabolic therapy, water-only fasting or restricted ketogenic diets like this. Once that, then you debulk the tumor, and you will get more of the tumor. The tumor will be less inflamed, less angry because of the metabolic therapy. And then once the tumor is debulked, you now move in with this kind of a keto and targeting glutamine now. These guys did not target the glutamine. Can you imagine how much longer they would live if, number one, we didn't do radiation, and number two, we targeted glutamine at the same time we're doing this diet? I predict, you can test me, they run a clinical trial, see if I'm wrong, we'd get 4 and 5 year survivals, not 3-year survivals. We get 4 and 5 year survivals. The tragedy is the field cannot accept what we're saying. They think you must irradiate these people, even though the radiation will free up the 2 fuels driving the dysregulated growth and contributing to the recurrence. We have published this. Others have published this. Why would you treat another human being with fuels that are going to make the tumor grow faster? Makes no sense. So something has to change. This is only the first step. So the next step would be, let's not irradiate these people, the GBM, and let's give them glutamine targeting drugs at the same time we're using this restricted Mediterranean ketogenic diet. What is wrong with this? Someone has to go to these, and I went there, I gave them lectures, and they seemed to, it was like they were deer in headlights. I don't know, they were staring at you. They almost couldn't understand what I was saying. Don't irradiate the brain. Is that hard to understand? So I think we're going to get much better survival. But the patients have to know this. They want to see the outcome. They want to see their destiny. Have them look at the survival curves using standard of care. It's abysmal. Why is that? Because the very treatments they're doing are contributing to the recurrence of the tumor. But this study is an eye-opener because there was 18 people. Was a clear difference between those that adhered and those that didn't. And I'm telling you, the ones that adhere, if they don't get irradiated and we target their glutamine at the same time, I think we're going to get 4 and 5 year survival.
Human conflict has changed throughout history, from pitched battles to the use of mass bombing campaigns. But one constant has been the development of new and often cruel ways of killing the opposing soldier. In this new video series, we shall be looking at some of the most disturbing weapons of war, And we will be starting things off with the chemical weapons of the First World War. It was during this war to end all wars that chemical weapons were first developed and used by all sides in an attempt to break the stalemate of the trench warfare, and to avoid the attrition warfare where thousands of lives were spent to claim little ground. The mere thought of the First World War conjures images of smoke-filled battlefields, of gas masks, and of soldiers debilitated by one of the most feared weapons of war. In the years preceding the Great War, a number of the world powers, including Germany, Britain and France, were signatories of the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907. Part of the conditions of this treaty was to ban the use of poisonous weapons, which many feared would prove catastrophic. However, the wording was somewhat confused, and resulted in interpretations as to just exactly what was banned. In addition, not every country signed the treaty, notably the United States, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. It was not long into the First World War that the first chemical weapons were deployed. It was the French who would use tear gas against the German forces as a means to incapacitate. It was deployed through the use of grenades and was designed to force soldiers to flee and break ranks. Whilst tear gas results in the burning of eyes and respiratory discomfort, it was not a lethal weapon and was one that was widely viewed as permitted by the Hague Conventions. Its deployment, however, did lead to the German military developing their own tear gas, using methylbenzyl bromide. In August of 1914, during the Battle of Belimov, around 18,000 of the gas shells were deployed against Russian positions, although this had little effect. The gas was rendered useless in the cold winter weather, as it would just harmlessly fall to the ground. German scientists would therefore develop a more effective gas, settling on chlorine gas. Chlorine was a byproduct of many industrial dye factories. As a gas, it causes extreme irritation to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs of those who are exposed. After a prolonged exposure to this gas, a person will die a painful death from asphyxiation. The German army had previously attempted to deploy a similar chlorosulfate gas against the British at Neuve-Chapelle. Although this failed as the chemical was incinerated by the explosive charges of the shells, meaning the gas had no effect. This was avoided on the 22nd of April 1915, when pressurized canisters containing around 150 tons of chlorine gas were deployed against French and colonial Algerian forces at Ypres. The French forces first saw a green cloud of smoke, and believing it was a smokescreen for an imminent attack, were ordered to the firing steps of the trenches. As the gas reached them, the French forces were routed and fled the gas, not knowing that running through the gas would only make the injuries worse. The Germans were stunned at the effectiveness of this gas, but they were not prepared to advance through the murderous cloud after seeing its deadly effect. In response, researchers soon found that there were ways to mitigate the effects of the gas. This would include keeping to high ground where possible, and using urine-soaked fabric to cover the mouth and nose, as the ammonia would neutralize the chlorine. Whilst they first issued a formal condemnation of the use of chlorine, the British, French and Russian forces nevertheless developed their own special gas companies to deploy their own gas. Though chlorine gas proved to be at times an ineffective weapon, easily affected by the wind, it soon became a weapon that the soldiers in the trenches would rightly fear. The British Army learned this the hard way in September of 1915, when around 150 tons of chlorine gas was deployed against the German trenches. The gas blew back towards the British lines, with some 2,000 casualties inflicted as a result. The next major breakthrough in the chemical gas arms race was the development of phosgene gas. Phosgene is a colourless gas that has a subtle smell of mouldy hay, meaning that it was much harder to detect than chlorine. It was also much more deadly and had a delayed effect on the victim, often taking a day or two for a person to die. The gas results in the lungs filling with liquid, meaning the afflicted would suffocate to death in agonizing pain. Phosgene gas was the preferred chemical agent employed by the British and French, though it was first deployed by the German forces. It was by far the deadliest of the gases used during World War I, responsible for 85% of the chemical weapon-related deaths. In many instances, phosgene was mixed with chlorine gas to increase its effectiveness. But by 1917, gas masks became a standard piece of equipment for the frontline soldiers, which would render the gas largely ineffective. Gas would again become a major threat in July of 1917, when the German army deployed mustard gas, perhaps the most infamous of the chemical weapons deployed during the First World War. Mustard gas is sulfur-based and a potent blistering agent. It is similar to phosgene, in that its effects are not seen right away, but it does have a distinct smell, described as garlic, rubber, or dead horses. After a few hours following exposure, the victim's eyes will start to water and get incredibly painful, before becoming temporarily blind. In addition, the affected skin will start to blister and burn, usually starting in the groin and armpits. These blisters would eventually burst, posing a risk of secondary infection. The gas would affect the lungs, causing internal bleeding and asphyxiation. Once affected, any second or third exposure to the gas would produce more severe reactions. It would often take months for a soldier affected to recover from exposure to mustard gas. Unlike the other gases that would disperse into the air, mustard gas would sink as an oily substance that would coat the affected area. This would result in great stretches of land being contaminated and left inhospitable for months. Whilst it was a hugely painful and demoralizing gas that caused a great deal of casualties, it did not cause many direct death, as in the open air, the concentration of the lethal dose was not often reached. The effects of chemical gas during World War I were profound. Around 1.3 million people were affected, and around 3% of that figure died as a result of exposure. But many more were left debilitated by the gas. Around 5% were left with permanent illnesses such as blindness or respiratory damage. There is also evidence to suggest that exposure to mustard gas could lead to skin cancers, leukemia, and severe eye conditions. For the general public, most were unaffected directly by the gas, though there were many reported instances of gas reaching civilian populations. It is thought that around 100,000 civilians were affected by gas attacks, as what we would now call collateral damage. These risks were well known to all sides of the conflict, with the British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig even writing in his diary, "My officers and I were aware that such weapons would cause harm to women and children living in nearby towns, as strong winds were common on the battlefront. However, because the weapon was directly against the enemy, none of us were overly concerned at all." Many more civilians, however, would be greeted with the effects of the chemical weapons, when soldiers would return home blistered, blind and broken by their exposure to the horrendous weapons. Though, the First World War was not the last use of these chemical weapons. The British had developed M devices, a new deployment method that was used against the Red Army in 1919. They were dropped from planes as a means to incapacitate the Bolshevik forces. In 1925, the Geneva Convention was signed to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, although despite this, many armies and countries still deployed gases such as tear gas against civilian populations. In the 1930s, Fascist Italy deployed chemical weapons against the under-equipped Abyssinian forces, which we do have a video on if you would like to see more. The link will be in the description. The tale of the use of chemical gas also includes the interesting case of Franz Haber, a talented German chemist. He was the son of a dyestuff manufacturer, meaning he was well aware of the abundance and effects of chlorine. In 1908, Haber was responsible for one of the greatest chemical discoveries of the 20th century. He discovered the process of converting atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, greatly improving access to fertilizer. But, as is often the case, Scientific development and genius can be used in warfare. Haber was eager to develop and promote the use of chemical weapons, and arguably the man most responsible for the chemical arms race. It was Haber who put forward the idea of releasing chlorine gas from cylinders which would be blown to enemy positions. It is hard to separate the horrors of the First World War and chemical weapons. The use of such weapons can perhaps be best seen as an example of the callous nature of those who ordered their deployment, or just as a way to finally bring an end to a costly bloody war by any means necessary. One would hope that the lessons of the First World War would mean the end of such weapons. Yet, this does not seem to be the case. For those who wish to read more, links will be in the description, as well as poems and accounts from those affected by the gas attacks that defined and scarred a generation.
Okay, I'm back. I thought I recognized Cornelius Rhoads. Quite a guy. Let me tell you a little bit about him before I get started here. Cornelius Rhoads, MD, a prominent Harvard-trained pathologist, conducted. Wait a second here. Okay. Cornelius Rhoads, MD, a prominent Harvard-trained pathologist, conducted a cancer experiment in Puerto Rico under the auspices of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations, resulted in the death of 13 subjects. He was accused of purportedly infecting his Puerto Rican subjects with cancer cells after a Puerto Rican physician uncovered the experiment in a handwritten letter. Dr. Rhoads wrote in a handwritten letter, he indicated that Puerto Ricans are beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate and thievish race of men who inhabited this sphere. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population. Yeah, that was according to Cornelius Rhoads, famous Harvard guy. But most people tend to leave his real story when they talk about he was the guy in charge of all the chemical weapons. Quite a psychopath, right? An official investigation covered up the facts to protect both Rhoads and the Rockefeller Institute. So what happened was he'd written this letter. Another doctor found the letter and turned him in. Good for him, right? Rhoads went on to establish U.S. Army biological warfare facilities in Maryland, Utah, and Panama, developing chemical weapons, and was later named to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Rhoads was also responsible for radiation experiments on prisoners, hospital patients, and soldiers. Rhoads was awarded the Legion for Merit for establishing chemical warfare labs in Maryland, Utah, and Panama. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1949. Was honored by the American Association for Cancer Research by naming its Exemplary Scientist Award to Cornelius Rhoads Award. So there was an award called the Cornelius Rhoads Award in 1979. So when the award went out, that award reignited the controversy over his experiments on and his racist views about Puerto Ricans. In 2003, the medal was rescinded. Yeah, that's Cornelius Rhoads, the famous Harvard MD. Huh. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this chemotherapy. Let me give you a little bit of a history. And I have a lot of this down below because it's a lot to try to absorb. Chemotherapy from poison to treatment. Mustard gas used in World War I, 1940s, found to shrink lymph nodes. But then in 1950s to 60s, scientists developed a thing called methotrexate, which cured, well, have you ever seen those ads from those, what's that hospital, Danny Thomas? It had all those horribly sick children. Yeah. Okay. I don't think children were cured of childhood leukemia, but I'll keep reading here. And carcinoma, a type of uterine cancer. Today, chemo drugs are often paired with other treatments in combination therapies. So it seems like it was first synthesized 1860 out of Germany. See, it's kind of funny how we keep going back to Germany, right? Before World War I, we just saw that clip about World War I, scientists were searching for toxic chemicals for industrial and medical purposes. In 1916, German chemists, including Fritz Haber, developed mustard gas as a chemical weapon. The German army first used it against British forces in Belgium, 1917, causing severe injuries and fatalities. So it's a blistering agent that severely damages skin, eyes, and respiratory. Although it was banned under the 1925 Geneva Protocol, mustard gas has still been used in some conflicts, making it a notorious chemical weapon. So then I was queuing up questions to ChatGPT. I asked, I said, how did something so toxic get to be a treatment for cancer? And they said, it's ironic. Yeah, it is ironic, isn't it? But mustard gas led to the development of some of the first chemotherapy drugs. This discovery happened during World War II when doctors noticed that soldiers exposed to mustard gas had low white blood cell counts. And they thought to themselves, well, hey, wait a minute. If we give this to a lot of people, we could kill a lot of people. And then pretty soon there'll just be us elites running things. We'll get rid of all that filthy human trash called the other people. I'm just kidding. It was never going to be anything but for destroying us. That's my opinion. I haven't found anybody else sharing that opinion, but it's my opinion. How mustard gas led to chemotherapy, World War II observations, doctors studied it. So here's where it gets interesting. I've been talking all along about damaging our DNA. That's the thing. Look at those poor babies over in Iraq. That is how you damage DNA, so nobody can procreate for there to the future without having horribly, sadly deformed children. Nitrogen mustard. Excuse me. Nitrogen mustard damages DNA in rapidly dividing cells, preventing them from reproducing. Where else have we heard this rapidly dividing cells from? Since cancer cells divide uncontrollably, they are more vulnerable to the drug than normal cells. The discovery of nitrogen mustard paved the way for modern chemo. And this is the amazing part, because I have read and read and read and read, and the only thing I could find that they have found since this nitrogen mustard is pills and stuff, right? So they say that the discovery of nitrogen mustard paved the way for modern chemotherapy. See, they keep calling it modern chemotherapy. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's the same stuff they've been using since 1917 or something, right? While they are no longer the first choice, derivatives like cytofluorescein are still used to treat leukemia, lymphomas, and some solid tumors. This shows how something originally designed as a weapon of war became a life-saving medical breakthrough. No, it was designed as a weapon of war and is still being used as a weapon of war against the rest of us. Another strategy, hormone therapy, cutting cancer's fuel supply. In 1890, Sir George Beatson discovered removing the ovaries, cut off the estrogen, could slow breast cancer. Oh, that's a pretty good solution, right? Just cut off the ovaries. 1960, the drug tamoxifen, Tamoxifen, emerged. It blocks estrogen and remains a key breast cancer treatment today. So when they're talking about modern treatment, somehow it doesn't enter my mind to be thinking the 1960s, really. Modern use, now used today for prostate cancer to block testosterone and other hormone-driven cancers. Yeah, these hormone-driven cancers, I've been saying this for years. Maybe you thought I was joking, but I've never been joking. How did we get so many feminized men and so many masculized women? Well, all babies in this country are born in a hospital, right? I think that 100% this is the way I think. Call me crazy, I really do not care. every baby gets taken to the back room to give a horrifying amount of vaccines. The boys get their penises whacked off without anesthesia, a lot of screaming, a lot of crying. Welcome to the world of trauma, right? So all these kids become traumatized the minute they are born. How hard would it be to slip in some estrogen for the boys and some testosterone for the girls? How else do you explain the fact? Look at my face in my old shows and stuff. I have a typical female jaw, tiny little teeth. The women now have massive, huge male jaws. They have absolutely massive teeth in their mouth. Those are male characteristics. And I've been saying for years, they got that way because they have been secretly flipping us. So if you think these same people would not have been slipping us with different hormones and stuff, what do you think goes into pediatric vitamins? What do you think goes into vitamins that pregnant women are taking? Well, they're all manufactured in China for a specific purpose, right? So then there's a couple of other things that they talk about, these other targeted therapies, going after cancer's weak spots. In 2001, remember this whole thing started in 1917, right? In 2001, this thing called Gleevec became a game changer. It targeted a specific protein in chronic myeloid leukemia cells while sparing healthy ones. Well, can you explain to me then why people are not living any longer than they have for the last 100 years when they get these treatments? Everybody dies quickly after these treatments. And then they go on to say now dozens of targeted therapies attack specific genetic mutations, ching, 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 or proteins in different cancers like HER2 inhibitors for breast cancer or EGFR inhibitors for lung cancer. So they have a category called immunotherapy, unleashing the immune system. Well, remember, I've already been telling you these drugs wipe out the immune system, right? Any drug, when they had me on those psychiatric drugs for depression and stuff, which I wasn't even depressed for, those drugs wipe out your immune system, full stop. You do not end up with a functioning immune system after you take any pills from these people. So let me take a look at this precision medicine. In the year 2000, in the 2000s, advances in genomic sequencing allowed scientists to map cancer DNA. A big deal, right? And now doctors can test tumors for mutations and pick treatments based on a patient's unique cancer blueprint. No, they pick treatments based on a patient's financial ability to pay for all of these services. People like myself would not even get offered all of these things because I do not have the money to pay for them. If you have money in this country, these are all of the options that you will be given, not people without money. People without money will not be getting any options to these treatments. So, and then they're bragging about this CRISPR, CRISPR. 2012, CRISPR gene editing became a reality, and now researchers are using it to reprogram immune cells and even cut out cancer-causing genes in early trials. All I can do is laugh. Then they said the next step, scientists are exploring nanotechnology, cancer vaccines, oncology viruses, and even AI-driven drug discovery. So, how do you think this is going to work out? Giving people x-rays and all this stuff. So it all started with the use of radiation advanced significantly after Marie and Pierre Curie developed radium in 1898, leading to the development of brachytherapy, internal radiation, and more refined external beam radiation therapies in the early 1900s. But they have been using basically the same treatment since the beginning because no new advances beyond radiation, right? So then ChatGPT says, well, it might seem like cancer treatment has stuck in the same old methods, surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy. But in truth, the science has evolved dramatically, even if the core idea to use radiation to kill cancer cells remains. Let's break it down. Number one, more precise radiation. Gee, just what we need, right? Early radiation therapy was rough, often damaging healthy tissue alongside tumors. Today, we have incredibly advanced techniques like IMRT. So that shapes the radiation beams to match the tumor shape. Well, that's a big deal. When they discovered that a couple of years ago, proton therapy uses protons instead of X-rays to target tumors more precisely, sparing healthy tissue. Stereotactic radiosurgery, high-dose radiation delivered in one or a few treatments, used especially for brain tumors. And I hope you paid attention to that clip that played that talks about sugar. Radiation sets sugar on fire. Can you imagine if you have a brain tumor and they're hitting your head with all this stuff, what it must, well, you could also ask those poor kids that had those, the kids that had the X-ray treatment over in Israel, those ringworm children. So yeah, those ringworm children, they were zapping them directly with X-ray equipment and saying that they were curing them, right? But they were actually killing them. So new treatment approaches have emerged. Radiation, let me see, CRISPR. Oh, is that CRISPR? Okay, personalized medicine. This is where it gets real expensive. Advances in genomics now allow doctors to tailor treatments to an individual's unique cancer profile. So even if two people have lung cancer, their treatment plans might look completely different. Yeah, because most doctors don't know what they're doing, right? So, of course, all the plans are going to look different because they're all fighting in the dark. If their first premise is that this is all genetic is wrong and it's all being created by sugar, any of their treatments should literally be tossed out the window, right? Except for Dr. Seyfried. He's the only one that I have any faith in this whole deal moving forward with. The few doctors I've been talking about. The rest of them, chuck them all out. So then they also have combination treatments. Radiation is often more effective when combined with other therapies. For example, some cancers respond better to radiation after chemotherapy shrinks the tumor first, or when combined with immunotherapy to make cancer cells more vulnerable. So they also have something called CAR T cell therapy, if you can believe any of this stuff. This is like reprogramming your body's immune system into a cancer-fighting machine. Here's how it works. They collect T cells. Doctors extract T cells, a type of immune cell, from the patient's blood. Then they do genetic modification. I'm sorry, this isn't funny. It's just disgusting. In a lab, scientists modify these T cells to produce special structures called chimeric antigen receptors. These help the T cells recognize specific proteins or on cancer cells. Huh. Expansion. The modified T cells are grown into the millions. Infusion. The supercharged T cells are put back into the patient's bloodstream, where they hunt down and destroy cancer cells. How about you do this? How about if you just cut out all the animal products and go to a single source plant diet? I don't know. Maybe just give it a whirl. I find that eating once a day is highly effective. You know, I have to, one day a week, I make a really delicious kind of vegetarian kind of a soup or something that I'm going to have for the whole week. I fill up my canning jars, put it in the refrigerator. I don't have to think about cooking for the rest of the week. All I have to think about is once a day, I eat a big pile of that soup or whatever I prepared to eat for the week. Very easy. And then I fast for 24 hours on the other day. So 6 days a week, I eat once a day around 6, 7, or 8 in the morning. Then I don't eat anything else. I do my fluids in batches. Do not just sit there guzzling fluids all day. You need all of your probiotics. People are always talking about, oh, take probiotics. But how about this? Don't be drinking fluids, sipping on something all day long. Don't be using mouthwash because you're destroying your own body's ability. Whatever your body's going to make is a million times better than what these people are going to sell you in a bottle. So I find it just very, very efficient to eat once a day. It's very easy. I don't have dishes in the sink or anything. I don't ever have snacks. I've never eaten snacks. You know, it's all how we were raised, because in the 50s and stuff, when I was raised, if we came home before dinner time and we were hungry, we'd say, Mom, what's for dinner? I'm hungry. Can I have something now? And she'd say, no, if you eat now, you're going to ruin your meal. So we were not offered snacks. We didn't say, oh, here's a bag of potato chips or here's a soda to drink. we didn't have any of that stuff. It was never offered to us because the belief was you save your appetite and eat a really good dinner, and then you go to sleep at a normal hour. Boy, things have sure changed, right? Parents are all up on their phones and their devices 24/7. Kids are on their devices 24/7. Who knows what everybody's doing on those devices, visiting porn sites and all this kind of stuff. Get off those devices as your first start if you want to re-identify yourself with your family. Get off those devices and start actually talking to these people you're sharing your space with. So anyway, so they have all this CRISPR stuff. I, I have lung cancer and radiation poisoning. Would I take any of these treatments? Well, no, I have not sought any medical care. I pulled myself out of the system, I don't know, around 2020 or so, or 2019 or so. I haven't seen a doctor. I will not see a doctor. I think that we're much better off by huddling together and working these things out ourselves. This has been one huge load of BS. And if anybody had bothered to look like, who is this Rhoads person? Why should he be in charge of all this stuff? Why'd he get this award? Well, then all you have to do is barely scratch the surface to find out Rhoads was a very problematic person, if you ask me. So anyway, so all this other stuff about this CRISPR stuff, and they say that CRISPR will turn off those proteins, leaving cancer exposed to it. Yeah, you're welcome to believe it if you wish to believe it. It sounds to me like a bunch of hocus pocus. A lot of this is based on the theory of magic. That's how it's all working. So they also show that research shows that 30 to 50% of cancer cases could be prevented through lifestyle changes, and diet is a big part of that. I'm not going to go through the whole diet thing. I believe you're better off staying away from the animal products. I'm still using some butter. I give the cats some butter because they're very sick, but I pulled away from the majority of all animal products. And people think, well, wait a minute, we're born to be carnivores. Where'd you get that information from? All these people on this carnivore diet, that information started with Joe Rogan. So always, and I mean always, check where you're getting your information from. They have done no studies. They point to things, oh, look, we have incisor teeth. That means we must eat meat. I don't believe we were ever supposed to eat meat. I believe meat was another one of their huge tricks to make us cannibals. They enjoy cannibalism on all of these rituals and stuff they're doing, these satanic rituals. They're using cannibalism. I think they came up with cows and stuff because cows are pretty passive animals, right? If you're going to corral a bunch of animals, would you corral a bunch of wolves and stuff? No, you'd probably corral a bunch of cows, right? If I saw a pack of, let's say, wild wolves running through the woods, I probably would be a little more concerned than if I saw a pack of cows running through the woods, right? So I think cows got picked on because they're so docile. So I don't, we come from an advanced society. I have a very hard time believing that when we go home, people are going to be saying, yeah, what cow are we going to eat today? I just don't think it works that way. And the longer I've looked, the more I come to that decision. So yeah, I think the best way to do it is through your diet. And most importantly of all, get some sleep. And before I close up, another thing that I have been highly suspect for a very long time. We have all these wind turbines all over the place, right? And there's generating electricity for the power station. Well, how exactly? And we also here in Nebraska, I'll give you an example of my state. In Nebraska, we have the utility is run by NPPD, which is Nebraska Public Power Works, okay? They control the entire state. As part of that, they have a nuclear station. It's called the Cooper Nuclear Station. And my question is this. They claim that these nuclear stations feed the power over to the main power plant, right? Well, I can't figure out how that works because how would you get power from, let's say, Nebraska has all these wind, you drive parts of the country around here, and all you see are fields of windmills, right? Or whatever they're calling them. Well, I think it's all a scam because I'm not really sure how the power gets from those windmills over to the power plant, right? Or how does it get from the nuclear place to the power plant? So let's explore that. Okay. Cooper Nuclear Station, or CNS, is located near Brownville, Nebraska, and is owned and operated by Nebraska Public Power District, NPPD. It serves as Nebraska's largest single unit source of carbon-free energy, generating approximately 835 megawatts of electricity, enough to supply over 385,000 residential customers during peak demand periods. So that all sounds great, right? But why is my utilities keep coming up? They keep saying, oh, we're going to get power, we're going to get free energy for everybody. So I asked GPT, how does this actually work? How does the transmission of electricity from the Cooper Nuclear Station get over to NPPD's power stations? And here's what they said. Generation at Cooper Nuclear Station produces electricity through nuclear fission, converting heat energy into electrical power. Number 2, step-up transformation. The generated electricity is first sent to a step-up transformer at Cooper Nuclear Site, which increases the voltage to efficient long-distance transmission. Transmission lines. The high voltage electricity is then transmitted via extra high voltage transmission lines. These lines are part of NPPD's extensive transmission network, spanning approximately 5,377 miles and covering nearly the entire state of Nebraska. Okay, so we got 5,377 miles of these extensive transmission networks, right? So they say that upon reaching NPPD's substations, the voltage is reduced through step-down transformers to levels suitable for distribution and use by consumers. Distribution. The electricity is then distributed through local power lines to residential, commercial, and industrial customers across Nebraska. This integrated system ensures that the electricity generated at Cooper Nuclear Site is efficiently transported and delivered to NPPD's customers, maintaining a reliable and stable power supply throughout Nebraska. So then I asked another question. I said, in Nebraska, I see windmills all over to produce electricity. How does it work, and how is it transported to power stations? And ChatGPT said, yes, Nebraska has a lot of wind farms because of its flat terrain and strong winds, making it an ideal place for wind energy. Here's how wind power works and how the electricity gets to the power stations. And remember, you can run this drill in your own town. The way it's going to fall apart is that well, there's not nuclear power stations in every state. Number one, that becomes a little bit tricky, right? But let me keep on the turbines for now. So, how do wind turbines produce electricity? Capturing wind energy. The wind turns the blades of a wind turbine. These blades are connected to a rotor, which spins as the wind blows, generating electricity. The rotor is connected to a shaft, which spins inside a generator. The generator converts the mechanical energy into electricity using electromagnetic induction. Voltage conversion. The generated electricity is low voltage, so a transformer inside the turbine increases the voltage for efficient transmission. How is wind power transported to power stations? Collection at a substation. Multiple wind turbines in a farm send their electricity through underground cables to a local substation. Okay, so now we figured out a new thing. So multiple wind turbines in a farm send their electricity through underground cables to a local substation. So in order to have installed all of those wind turbines, somebody would have had to have dug underground cables to a local substation, okay? And they say here, another transformer boosts the voltage even higher, usually to 34,000 to 765,000 volts for long-distance transmission. Transmission over power lines. The high voltage electricity travels through a network of transmission lines, often owned by utility companies. These lines take in the electricity to power stations, grid substations. At power stations, the voltage is lowered so it can be safely distributed to homes and businesses. Local power lines then carry the electricity to your outlets at around 120 to 240 volts. So what I don't really get is this. They're they're transporting around plutonium. This whole thing escapes me, okay? It flat out escapes me. So what they're saying is that, so why is Nebraska a good place for wind power? They say strong, steady winds across the Great Plains. Well, first of all, I don't find Nebraska to be very windy at all, personally. I've lived in other places that are much windier. And they say lots of open land. Of course, that's true. Growing investment. Okay, here we go. Nebraska is already getting a big chunk of its electricity from wind, and that number is increasing. Every year my bill gets higher and higher, right? So then I asked the question, how much wind does Nebraska produce versus other states? And ChatGPT said this, Nebraska has made significant strides in wind energy production, positioning itself among the top states in the U.S. Here's how Nebraska compares to other states. Nebraska, in December 2024, Nebraska generated approximately 1,068,000 megawatts of electricity from wind. Top wind producing states as of December 2024. Texas is first. It was 25.6 of U.S. total. Iowa, 9.6 U.S. total. Oklahoma, 3,352 miles. Illinois is another one. And Kansas. So wind energy as a percentage of total electricity generation. Nebraska, wind power accounted for 29.8 of the state's total electricity generated in 2024. This can't be true. It just really can't be true, right? Top states by percentage. Iowa, 60%, South Dakota, 58%, Kansas, 48%, New Mexico, 45%, and Oklahoma, 44%. Nebraska's 29th place is among the leading states for wind energy distribution. Well, okay, so Nebraska ranks 4th among U.S. states for potential wind energy. Well, who's cleaning up on this stuff, right? And then I asked the question, how do wind farms get picked? In other words, can anybody have a wind farm? And ChatGPT says, wind farms aren't just built anywhere. There's a process to determine the best locations. Well, technically, anyone with enough land could try to build one. Large-scale wind farms require careful planning, permits, and investments. Here's how wind farm sites are chosen and what it takes to have one. Wind speed and consistency, okay, land availability, sure, access to transmission lines. The site must be close to power lines that can transport electricity to the grid. If transmission infrastructure is lacking, the cost of building new lines can be a major barrier. Okay. Environmental. Developers must assess wildlife. Oh, yeah, okay. So permitting and all that. So you can buy a small scale personal wind turbines or large scale. Landowners lease the property to developers, typically earning $3,000 to $8,000 per turbine per year. So then the process of developing winds is complex and can take several years. Well, here's where we get to the part that the theft comes in. You have to get all this approval and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I have the rest of this down if you want to know every detail, but okay. Small wind projects, maybe quicker, 1 to 3 years. Large scale can take 5. Okay. So they lease them for 20 to 30 years, fixed annual payments, revenue sharing, typical earnings, 3,000 to 8,000 per. Now this is all being subsidized by the government, right? So per turbine, you get 3,000 to 8,000 per turbine per year. Sign-up bonuses or one-time up payment fees may be offered. Uh, and who's involved in that? Well, Berkshire Hathaway. I went to look for it. I had ChatGPT tell me who were some of the big wind developers in Nebraska, and that's Nextra Era Energy, Inventagry, EDF Renewables, and Berkshire Hathaway. That's Warren Buffett, right? So then I asked the question, for example, how much does Berkshire make in Nebraska on the wind turbines? And ChatGPT said this: Berkshire Hathaway, or Warren Buffett, has made significant investments in Nebraska's wind energy sector, particularly through the development of the Grande Prairie Wind Farm in Holt County. The 400 megawatt facility completed in late 2016 marked a substantial increase in the state's wind energy capacity. While BHE's total energy revenue was approximately $21 billion in 2024, specific revenue, and they get money from all kinds of places. But anyway, so it's worth billions of dollars, right? And I asked another question: how much for Berkshire's is also government subsidized? Berkshire Hathaway Energy has significantly benefited from government subsidies, particularly in the renewable energy sector, while specific figures for Nebraska aren't fully detailed. So they came up with some things, and this one company got 139 million in federal grants in 2009. Another company got 15 million. Geico entities have got a big thing. Geico, the insurance people. Well, direct subsidy figures, Warren Buffett's perspective. Warren Buffett has acknowledged the importance of these tax credits, stating, I will do anything that is basically covered by law to reduce Berkshire's tax rate. For example, on wind energy, we get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. Bing, 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 bing. So do you really think Warren Buffett is building these wind farms to help anybody but his own pocket? Well, of course not. Warren Buffett was also involved in that whole Warren Buffett is as filthy as the rest of them. So anyway, of course he's in there getting all those tax credits. But then I have to question, do you think these things really hook up? I mean, are they really doing anything? I don't know. Like I said, I posted it all down below. Please take a look and help me solve this mystery. How do they really get that power from those wind things? Like they have these wind things all out in the oceans now, knocking out the whales and all kinds of stuff. How they build those? How they build under the ocean to get those wind tunnels from the ocean, from this ocean onto the land into those power stations? Just logically, it does not make any sense. So anyway, so let me tell you what I have down below here. I have Dr. Seyfried. The man is brilliant. I really hope you'll listen to the entire clip. I only paid about 10 minutes of the clip today, but he goes into some very specific details. If you would be interested in watching the full clip, it's down below. And then I have the articles about those Harvard scientists rigging the system. And I have links to what I've been talking about as far as mustard gas and, a good article, Insanity, Mustard Gas Chemotherapy Feeds Cancer Instead of Fighting It. So there's a lot to read. And I have, Dr. Seyfried has written a few books. I don't know that I've gotten them all, but I have the ones that I was able to locate readily. I think the man is a superstar. And if you want to keep following him, I would suggest you follow his YouTube channel. He's coming up with some very good information. He just came up with this glutamine thing just the last week or two. And I've been saying this for years, and I'm going to say it one more time, but I might even say it even more times. Your phone could become a liability. Consider burner phones. If you're in a household with more than one person, get walkie-talkies. Do not leave your house with your phone. They're grabbing up phones. They're sending people off to other countries because of what they're finding on their phones. This is all likely a staged act, but what they're telling you is this: all bets are off. They are grabbing people right and left and sending them to different countries. They do not care. This is the plan, not the bug in the system. So I have some specific advice down below for you to take a look at. Because right now, between all of these private prisons they have, they're building like crazy all over the place. They want to fill those prisons with those of us that they can catch, okay? And you'll notice the words, start paying attention to how they're using the words in the news. Everything is talking about being a terrorist. Anything anybody does, they claim is a terrorist. And that is because after 9/11, they came up with all these terrorist rulings. That's why they're gang stalking a lot of us by claiming that we're actually the terrorists. Now, I personally do not feel like I should be classified as a terrorist, but hey, obviously the government thinks that way. So watch their language. They're now referring to just about everything as terrorists. They're saying, we got to make our country safe again. We got to get these people out of here. Well, they let them in, okay? Don't forget that part. So I have to close this up. I will be back with the Russians and the whole deal. I'm sure that those kids from those orphan trains came out of Russia. They came out of that whole area there. So I took a really good look at Russia before I got to the part where these gypsies and the rest of the gypsy story. And yes, spoiler alert, the same group running gypsies was the same group running the Russians. So anyway, I'll be back later. Be safe out there and goodbye for now.